Britain isn't fighting in the Middle East. Britain doesn't import directly from Iran. And yet, if you have a mortgage, you are already paying for the war. Not through a tax, not through a government program, through something far less visible and far more expensive. This is how a 33-kilometer waterway 3,500 miles away ends up on your monthly bank statement. Most people hear Middle East conflict and think foreign policy. Here's why that framing is costing them money. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide, but 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes through it every day. Around 18 million barrels of crude oil, plus enormous volumes of liquefied natural gas. There is no real alternative route, no pipeline large enough to compensate. Since the Iran conflict escalated, shipping insurers have raised premiums on tankers operating in the region sharply. Several major carriers have rerouted vessels around Africa, adding weeks and significant cost. Oil, which opened 2026 at $71 a barrel, has crossed $100. But the oil price is just the beginning. Here's what actually matters. A $30 rise in oil doesn't just hit the petrol pump, it raises the input cost of nearly everything in the economy. Food production, manufacturing, logistics, delivery. Every extra cost works its way into the price of goods in shops, on your phone, at the supermarket checkout. Economists estimate that every 10% rise in oil prices adds 0.2 to 0.4 percentage points to UK inflation. The move from $71 to $100 is a rise of over 40%. For the Bank of England, whose single mandate is 2% inflation, that number changes everything. And here's the detail about the British mortgage market that almost no commentary mentions. The bank was already in a difficult position before the oil shock hit. Having raised rates sharply between 2022 and 2023, the fastest tightening cycle in a generation, it was finally beginning to cut them in late 2024. For millions of British homeowners, that wasn't abstract. It was the difference between a manageable repayment and a crippling one. In 2022, the average two-year fixed mortgage sat at around 2.5%. By 2023, it had hit 6%. On a £250,000 mortgage, that's roughly £1,000 a month in additional repayments. The rate-cutting cycle was the path back. And then the oil price moved. But here's what makes Britain uniquely vulnerable compared to almost every comparable economy in the world. In France, Germany, and the United States, long-term fixed-rate mortgages of 15 to 30 years are the norm. In the UK, most people fix for 2 or 5 years. That means a far higher proportion of British homeowners are exposed to rate changes at any given time, which brings us to a number that should be making front-page news, but isn't. There are roughly 1.8 million fixed-rate mortgage deals in the UK due to expire in 2026 alone. When those deals expire, those households remortgage into whatever rate environment exists at the time. If the bank has been able to cut, the process is painful but manageable. If the oil shock has forced it to hold, those households face a serious problem. To understand where this ends, it helps to understand where it's happened before. In October 1973, a coalition of Arab oil-producing states imposed an embargo on countries that had supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Britain was among the targets. Within months, the oil price had tripled. The government introduced a 3-day working week to conserve energy, and UK inflation, already uncomfortably high, hit 25% by 1975. The Bank of England's response? Raise interest rates sharply to force inflation back down. Mortgages became dramatically more expensive. House purchases collapsed. An entire generation of homeowners found themselves trapped between an economy that wasn't growing and repayments they couldn't afford. The mechanism hasn't changed. What has changed is the speed and the fact that this time the vulnerability is already built into the system, locked into millions of short-term mortgage deals taken out when rates were at historic lows. But there's one part of the current picture the 1973 comparison doesn't capture. In 1973, Britain had some leverage. It had North Sea oil coming online. It had political room to maneuver. Today, the Bank of England is navigating this with almost no margin for error, because it has to manage two competing disasters at once. The bank doesn't just set rates based on where inflation is today, it sets them based on where it expects inflation to be in 12 to 18 months. And when an oil shock of this magnitude lands, those forecasts change fast. Cut rates too soon, Inflation reignites and the bank loses the credibility it spent 2 years buying back at enormous cost to the economy. Hold rates too high, economic growth stalls, and the remortgage cliff facing 1.6 million households becomes a housing crisis. There is no good option here, only the question of who pays. And the answer, as it almost always is in these situations, is that the people who pay are the ones who had the least say in the matter. Not the oil producers, not the shipping companies, not the central bank. The 9 million households in the United Kingdom who simply bought a home, fixed their rate when the numbers made sense, and are now waiting for a decision made in Threadneedle Street that is itself being shaped by events in a waterway most of them couldn't place on a map. It would be easy to say the answer is energy independence, and in the long run, it is. But building enough renewable infrastructure to insulate the UK from global oil markets takes decades. The remortgage cliff arrives in months. What this episode makes visible, more clearly than almost anything else, is the true structure of the global economy. Energy markets don't stop at national borders. Inflation doesn't stay in the country where the supply shock originates. And the decisions that determine whether millions of British families can afford their homes in 2026 are not being made by the government they elected. They are being shaped by a conflict Britain isn't fighting, over resources Britain doesn't directly import, in a region most people here will never visit. There is a strange irony in that. The United Kingdom has one of the most sophisticated mortgage markets in the world, and one of the oldest central banks. And yet, the single most important variable in whether British homeowners can afford to stay in their homes this year is not the quality of economic policy in London. It's what is happening in a 33-kilometre strait in the Persian Gulf. That is how interconnected the global economy has become, and for most people, that interconnectedness doesn't arrive as a headline about foreign policy. It arrives as a line item on a bank statement. That just got worse.